Welcome to our monthly CSWEF Center for Sustainable Work and Employment Futures webinar. Just to let everyone know, this webinar will be recorded. Our speaker today is Dr. Saori Shibata. She's joining us from Birmingham, but Dr. Shibata is based in Leiden University Institute for Area Studies. Her research focuses on Japan's political economy. What she's studying is how Japan's model of capitalism is changing and becoming more neoliberal, and how this is being contested by Japan's increasingly precarious workforce. So her research draws on institutionalist approaches to capitalism and critical political economy, cultural political economy approaches, and contributes to debates in both international and comparative political economy. So today she's going to be speaking on Japan's gig economy, flexible labor, and fictitious freedom. Now, a couple of housekeeping points before I hand over to Dr. Shibata. As per the CSWEF format, Dr. Shibata will present her work in the first 40 minutes. After her presentation, Dr. Phoebe Moore, one of our CSWEF Center members, in her role as a discussant, will have approximately 10 minutes to talk about the presented paper. Dr. Phoebe is an associate professor in the business school and the editor for the new journal, Global Political Economy, to be launched soon this year. This will be followed by us taking questions and comments from the audience. You can use the raise hand icon or the chat function to type in and submit your questions in the chat, which I can pick up. And without further delay, I would hand over to Dr. Saori Shibata. Over to you, Saori.
Yeah. Thank you. Let me just share my screen first. Let me just get this out. Hope that you can see my screen. Can you see my screen now?
That's okay, sorry.
Yeah, okay, so let me start. Thank you very much for inviting me to this seminar. I'm really delighted to have opportunity to talk about Japan's gig economy. As Chandrima introduced, I'm from the Leiden University, but presenting from King's Heath in Birmingham. So it's not so exciting overseas guest because so close to Leicester. But hopefully today's discussion that I can discuss over the gig economy studies with other colleagues as well. So let me start. So today I will talk about Japan's gig economy. First, I start with the concept of gig work. We tend to get lazy about those concepts. So kind of, I know that lots of people who are here, the scholars also specialize in gig work and digital economy or gig economy. So it may not require further detail, but let me start with some kind of brief introduction what this gig work is about. And then I will try to introduce various debates surrounding gig economy and gig work. And then I will introduce various recent development in this field of study, various critical studies, the various studies which adopted different types of theories and approaches. So I briefly touch upon the recent studies, particularly the critical studies over the gig economy. And then today's focus is about to shift our attention to the development of the pro-gig economy in discourse in the context of Japan, particularly by integrating the cultural political economy approach, which my paper adopted, by paying attention to certain selectivities, so-called structural selectivities, discursive selectivities, and technological selectivities or pressures in the context of Japan, and how they promoted or enabled the development of a gig economy and gig work. And today's talk, particularly, I try to build upon the notion of a fictitious freedom, the fictitious nature of freedom, fictitious nature of autonomy surrounding the gig economy and gig work in Japan. So let me start with the concept of a gig work. I think there are various ways of describing this gig work. Obviously, gig work is one way. Some people might call it click work. Some people might call it platform work or crowd work. In Japan, it's often referred to crowd work or online work, online freelance work. And also not just only the online-based platform work, but also we do have a physical gig work as well, which started with like drivers, delivery work. And also increasingly recently, I think we started seeing the emergence of more broader sectors work, such as office work, and then the service sector, which include maybe the care workers or nurses, and those types of service sector workers also getting started being provided by the platform economy. So the gig work is often defined as a form of labor which gives organization or individuals access via online platforms to large number of workers who are willing to carry out paid tasks.
43. Let's go.
A platform is a business which creates interactions between producers and consumers and provides an open participative infrastructure that facilitates the exchange of goods and services. Platform therefore can be considered an online labor brokerage that acts to cyber coordinate the market of a service worker and the requester of work for certain tasks and jobs. So gig working is therefore a process that enables large number of workers to engage in paid tasks, which are made available through online platforms, rather than from traditional employers. So this normally takes the form of fragmented tasks, micro-tasks provided through online platforms, and that connect online-based workers with hiring firms. So gig working has been promoted by global corporate elites, consultants, political elites. In the case of Japan, we started seeing the increase in number of gig workers from the mid-2010s onwards. Maybe in UK or US, maybe there's a much earlier development of such expansion of the gig workers. But official discourses surrounding the gig work tend to be very positive and highlights the benefits of gig work. So gig work it is claimed that can provide workers with an opportunity to achieve an enhanced degree of autonomy in terms of choosing when to work, what tasks to perform, where to work. It may be this appeal to autonomy that maybe is central to this official discourse that identifies the key advantages of the new digital economy. Also, benefits include the appeal to the heightened inclusivity and accessibility that gig work provides, particularly by offering opportunities to a broader range of people, including those whose mobility or availability prevents them from working regular hours. Also, the gig work is considered that it can resolve geographical challenges because of the nature of an online platform. And also some also highlight gig work enables a better or a more efficient match between the supply and demand of skills. Some highlights the gig work enables the possibilities that gig work can democratize idea generation. So as long as you are connected to online, everybody can present their ideas, demonstrate their creativity on the platform, and they get paid by those each of those tasks. So this official discourse has developed in different forms in different international contexts, but nevertheless, it is quite striking that how consistently it has been deployed across the advanced industrial democracies, by both governments and also the leading firms. So there are a number of statements on the topic made by international and national firms, as well as the governments and international organizations, each of which point towards a common underlying theme. So for instance, like McKinsey, the global consulting firm, claimed that there are 68 million freelancers in the US do it by choice. And then they report that they were happier having moved away from their traditional 9-to-5 work style. And Taylor Review of Modern Working Practices, they portray gig work in terms of being capable of addressing the needs of people actively choosing to work outside of the traditional employment model. And former Prime Minister Theresa May referred to this Taylor Review and supporting this view, and claimed that the government needed to avoid overbearing regulations in order to ensure the UK remains as a home to innovation, new ideas, and new business models. And international organizations such as World Bank report welcomes also gig work and argues that it provides opportunities for on-the-job learning and skills development for youth and employment. And the European Commission describes how the collaborative economy, including platform-based work and gig work, generates new employment opportunities, generating revenues beyond traditional linear employment relations. So those languages and discourses adopted by global elites, international organizations, sort of one-sidedly focus on the benefits of gig economy. There are, however, a number of reasons to be skeptical regarding the discourse that has tended to accompany the introduction of gig work. Gig work has a tendency to result in a number of concerning trends, including heightened uncertainty and instability within the labor market. Also, we witnessed fragmentation and decomposition of work tasks, basically, which is a process of breaking down the jobs, the production processes into tiny, simple and repetitive tasks that will be offered to online-based gig workers. So such fragmented tasks, as we can imagine, can lead to de-skilling of workers, and also it can drive down wages. We also see heightened precarity as a result of the lean status of the platform economy. In terms of in legal terms, gig workers are usually considered contractors rather than employees, and are therefore without entitlements to training, benefits, overtime pay, or paid holidays. So there's a lot of disadvantages associated with gig work due to that often depicted as contractors. Some scholars argue that the platform-based work is a continuous employment relations without continuous work. As a result, this makes the practice of non-standard and unpredictable work scheduling increasingly common and disrupts work-life balance and work schedules because the gig worker needs to be continuously available to prove that they were efficient and productive gig workers on the platform. So we have therefore been witnessing a shift in the forms of domination and control imposed upon labor from a direct, physical and on-the-site type towards more increased use of indirect mechanism of domination, maybe, as a result of intensifying competition, rendering workers less visible, and in turn suppressing wages and working conditions. So the notion that the gig work represents a new form of autonomous employment in which workers are freed up to pursue a much greater selection of employment opportunity is therefore questionable. It is in this sense that we might more adequately conceptualize official pro-gig work discourse as being built upon the notion of fictitious freedom. So pro-gig work discourse draws upon in a one-sided way the opportunities for greater autonomy, whilst concealing and neglecting the substantial constraints that probably exist. Pro-gig work discourse may present the market as something neutral, as a neutral mechanism through which economic actors can acquire greater freedom as a result of the opportunities to enter into acts of exchange. But for instance, the ability of gig economy to enable the better match between supply and demand in the market, that's a way of presenting market as something neutral. But as we know, market is not such a neutral kind of place. So promoting the market as the means through which to ensure heightened freedom, therefore reflects underlying power relations, which themselves are marked by imbalances and relationships of domination and subordination. The gig work as autonomy discourse reflects this gig work as autonomy discourse has a similarities with Luke's third phase of power, in which that he argues that the interest and options available to actors are themselves subjected to imbalance of power, and therefore creates indirect and sometimes unobservable forms of domination. So there's many, as I introduced, there are many critical studies developed. So when I finished writing the paper and then the publication came eventually, after that there's a lot more studies or maybe simultaneously been developed. And the studies been continuously, the studies of gig economy has been, I think, progressing significantly. There's a lot of publications surrounding this gig economy. So just pick a few. I wanted to show some of the examples. I mean, we do have Phoebe and Paul here who already published really insightful articles. So then some of the frameworks or theories that often adopted is that maybe the labor process theory, which are often used to analyze, examine the gig work and development of the gig economy and gig work. Paul's work, but on top of labor process theory, integrate the concept of Gramscian hegemony or Foucauldian governmentality. Others integrate the concept of Bourdieu's notion of capital or field. Myself integrated the cultural political economy, which I'm going to talk after this. There's other studies, critical studies, which kind of focus typology, conceptualization. Some studies focus on the country-specific case or a region-specific case or sector-specific case. So there's been this kind of development. Some study focus on the growing level of attachment and commitment among the gig workers. And also importantly, Phoebe is here as well, that some scholars already started paying attention to resistance, refusal, and solidarity among the gig workers. So as we can see, there have been many studies which critically evaluate the gig economy. However, the broader national context within which pro-gig work attitudes emerged are still understudied. So the role and motive of the government actors could be considered even more for future studies, I think. We could also provide a concrete explanation of the broader pressures that led to the particular form of gig work. So this paper trying to highlight that we need an account of gig work which takes account of the structural pressures that have contributed to its development, its emergence and its development, including the discursive apparatus through which gig work has been advanced. So this is why I trying to introduce the cultural political economy approach, which my paper draws on. So some of you might be well aware of this, know much better than I do, maybe, but this approach is developed by Jessop and Sam. And this approach combines an appreciation and understanding of material pressures arising from the reproduction of capitalism with the discursive processes that constitute this materiality. So I think this approach, I think it's useful and is suited to the study of processes of capitalist restructuring where we are keen to understand the way in which this interacts with the ideas, narratives, languages, and discourse that accompany that restructurings. So this approach, one of the components of this approach is that integration of constructivist approach. So constructivist approach tend to focus on ideas, identities, and their role within socio-economic processes. This contrasts with more materialist approaches, which consider pressures and trends generated by socio-economic structures. This approach, however, cultural political economy approach seeks to transcend this dichotomy and aims to reconcile both ideational and material concerns. So cultural political economy approach considers socio-economic pressures to have a tendency to favor particular outcomes, whilst nevertheless understanding that the societal outcomes are ultimately contested and undetermined. In doing so, it's trying to understand the role of ideas and discourses as part of wider structure of capital accumulation. And this cultural political economy approach offers a framework through which to consider the discourse that tends to accompany socioeconomic developments, such as in this case, the development of a gig economy and gig work. This approach is therefore concerned especially with the relationship between the structural pressures and then ideas which develop alongside such pressures or as a part of such pressures. So to do this, the Jessop and Sam suggest to pay attention to the selection of certain ideas or strategies, actions or certain agents. And they talk about structural, agential, discursive, and technological selectivities. So they refer to the way in which asymmetrical power relations create a greater potential for the adoption or privileging, favoring, or selection of certain agents, certain strategies, or certain actions, or certain ideas over others. So from here that I kind of move towards more sort of the context of Japan. So structural selectivity is how that we are seeing the emergence of gig economy in the context of Japan. Adopting the cultural political economy, I trying to explain that what's the kind of transformation in the structural pressures, what's the changes, what's new pressures are emerging in the context of Japan. So start with the pre-1990s, the labor market in Japan, which may be crudely speaking, but simply speaking, might be characterized by sort of a coordination, the stability, as well as the discipline. Such coordination, some people might call the coordinated market economy, which suppress that potential discontent or dissatisfaction and achieves stability, certain economic growth. Such economic growth and stability were particularly enabled by the long-term employment arrangement, seniority wage system, or within the company training system for core workers. Those kind of coordination, stable employment relations contained a dissent among workers to a certain extent. Also, productivity was secured by the method of just-in-time production or teamwork, incremental improvement, such as Toyotism. They disciplined labor, but at the same time, they provided certain kind of employment security. So that's this kind of coordination characterized the labor market in Japan. And also, on top of such employment practices, the cooperative unions, so-called enterprise union system, restrained wages demands in order to maintain firms' competitiveness in exchange for maybe the long-term employment security and incremental wage increases. So there was certain source of tension. It's not like everything was harmonious and rosy in the Japanese labor market pre-1990s. There was a source of tension, but such tension was marginalized to a certain extent by the consensus and compromise which was kind of functioning pre-1990s. So Japan's accumulation model has experienced, however, the number of significant problems over the past couple of decades, resulting in a process of transformation, including the heightened economic liberalization. And we have seen considerable changes to the prior coordination, which I just introduced, such coordinated Japanese growth model. The result of the reforms introduced in the 1990s was an erosion of some of the key principles that had produced stability and discipline prior to 1990s. As a result of these changes, Japan represents interesting case within which to consider the introduction of a gig work. So here, adopting the structural selectivity suggested by Jessup and Sam. So structural selectivity refers to, it is a term used to describe the different asymmetrical sets of constraints as well as opportunities available to different social groups, and therefore corresponds most closely to what we might consider the materialist approaches within political economy. So here that I would like to introduce some of the structural selectivities that Japan has been experiencing. Japan has been widely noted for the sluggish growth, stagnant growth. It's experienced since the bursting of the bubble economy in early 1990s. And one of the key structural pressures that has accompanied the period of sluggish growth has been the pressure to identify new opportunities for productivity and competitiveness. And reflecting such pressures, the series of labor market reforms have been introduced over the past 3 decades or so. And this includes both an increased flexibilization on employment, a significant increase in the proportion of the lifelong employment practices, and the increased workforce of non-regular workers. So as you can see that it was 15% or so, the proportion of non-regular workers in the mid-80s, and that's becoming almost nearly 40% over the last decade or so. So this significant change in the labor market we are witnessing as well. So we are kind of witnessing a shift from the lifelong, long-term secure employment practices that are typically considered to be a central element to the Japanese labor market, post-war economic model of Japan, towards the use of more temporary, potentially more precarious, fixed-term agency workers. So this is a process that has been driven by both government and also changes to firms' hiring practices. So we have witnessed a shift in power between social forces. On one hand, ascendance of a new entrepreneurial fraction of capital. On the other hand, we are seeing the decline in the power of established unions, trade unions, faced with a decline in membership because of the core group of regular workers. The proportion of such regular workers have been continuously declining. And also, alongside this process of labor market liberalization and a shift in power, we have seen a parallel labor shortage, partly due to maybe illiberal migration policy, as well as a decline in fertility rate. Along with this process, we have witnessed increasing expression of discontent among workers, particularly non-regular workers, as a result of their experience of casualized employment. A labor shortage and increased level of discontent among those workers have each created the new levels of pressure upon the state as well as the firm to identify and introduce new forms of work which are flexible enough, but at the same time prompt lower level of resentment by workers. So one of the most recent developments in this process of labor market liberalization, facilitated by the emergence of the gig economy, maybe has been the emergence of the introduction of a gig work. So each of these pressures have combined within the context of Japan's political economy to produce concrete structural pressures or structure using the Jessup and some selectivities, encouraging both the Japanese government as well as the Japanese firms to identify new patterns of working in order to address both sluggish growth, labor shortage challenge, rising popular discontent. So it is in this context with the structural selectivities that are generated as a result that gig work has become an increasingly attractive option for both Japanese state actors and firms. So as we shall see soon there, they are in the next point, this has basically in turn combined with prevalent discourses within Japan to produce a concrete official pro-gig work discourse to promote the move towards gig working. So now we turn to discursive selectivity, the second point of the cultural political economy. Discursive selectivities refers to the way in which different discourses face particular constraints and opportunities, thereby favoring certain arguments over others, as well as favoring the voice of certain advocates of those arguments over other advocates, other arguments. Discursive selectivities has filtering effects and therefore make it more or less easy to develop specific appeals, specific arguments, specific claims, specific legitimations than others. As part of the introduction and expansion of gig work within the Japanese labor market, both the Japanese state and firms have supported the types of official pro-gig work discourse, drawing attention to the opportunities for autonomous working. This represents an attempt to reconcile the structural pressures, which we just kind of seen in the structural selectivities, with a number of discursive conventions. So in this sense that we see the complex combination between both structural and discursive selectivities, they both interact together to produce that specific efforts at legitimating discourse that accompanies the introduction of gig work within the Japanese context. Three discursive themes are particularly important here in considering the introduction of gig work. So first, the much perceived need for Japanese policymakers to address and to find new avenues through which to facilitate improve productivities, facilitate productivity gains in the context of Japan's low sluggish growth. And second, pro-gig work discourse appears to address the unfavorable working conditions experienced by both non-regular and regular workers. So for instance, in announcing a series of liberalizing labor market reforms, the former Abe administration pointed out that these reforms would reduce the division between the regular and non-regular workers, and we can achieve an improved work-life balance. We can tackle the convention of long working hours, which is a particular problem in the case of Japan. And we can also extend the range of work forms available for different individuals at different life stage. So by articulating the potential opportunities provided by more flexible forms of work style, present itself at addressing the current problematic division that exists between regular and non-regular workers, which became increasingly problematic, and the discontent was raised. So then the former government, current government as well, trying to promote new forms of work, flexible work, such as gig work. And also thirdly, finally, the widely remarked need to address a number of obstacles that are currently preventing labor market participation. So particular discourse has been articulated. For instance, the government in its work style reform emphasized that how female workers have been prevented from working due to the gendered nature of family caring duties, and pointing to the way in which long working hours act as a further barrier to such a female participation in the labor market. So therefore, the government re-articulates the necessity of the enhancement of female labor participation and present the gig work is that opportunity for female workers. And also not just the female workers, but also the elderly workers opportunities as well highlighted. So some of the platform companies, they portray gig work as a means by which the elderly can find work outside of the traditional employment relations. Gig firms therefore promote alternative forms of work, problematizing traditional work practices of long hours and also poor work-life balance, and trying to create a pro-gig work environment for people who tend to be excluded from the labor market. At the same time, integration of elderly workers is also claimed to contribute to the alleviation of the problem of labor shortage. And also it can address to the aging society challenge as well. So the Japanese policymakers and firms have consistently advocated the opportunities gig work creates for current non-regular workers, or female workers, or young workers, or elderly workers, or workers in rural economies. Business associations such as Keidanren supports gig work and warns the government not to over-regulate the gig business. And gig firms such as Crowdworks, they're one of the largest platforms company in Japan, trying to highlight the ability of crowdsourcing to reduce staff costs by eliminating office space, eliminating equipment, eliminating workers' benefits or insurance, thereby contributing to the growth and productivity. So they kind of advocate the benefits for the employers. The government praise the various ministries under the government also praise the gig work, and they themselves became the users of such gig services as well. So discursive selectivities have played a crucial role in terms of both framing the types of discourse that have accompanied the introduction of gig work. So discourse adopted by both the government and firm highlights the important way in which gig work represents an attempt to address concerns that have become common themes within the the popular discourse in Japan. So finally, we touch upon the technological selectivities. Technological selectivity is built upon the notion that technologies can shape our choices and have capacity to discipline and control our acts. In more detail, technological selectivity refers to strategic tools, toolkits, mechanisms, and logics that selectively limit our conduct or choice, limit our thoughts, limit our possibilities, limit workers' opposition, and the scope for change and alternatives. So we therefore need to pay attention to how workers' choices and opportunities have been shaped, limited, or controlled in Japan from the point of technological selectivities. As we have seen, Japan experiencing a process of flexible employment relations, flexibilization of employment relations, in seeking to maintain and advance such flexible labor market through the more recent development and promotion of gig work, the Japanese government has sought to encourage the development of technologies that represent a greater degree of workplace control. So Japanese government seeks to advance the dissemination of technology that facilitates gig work, which has in turn enabled firms to employ technologies that heighten the degree of economic competition and work surveillance. So for instance, in seeking to establish and promote gig work, one of the ministries, Ministry of Health, Labor and Welfare, has undertaken a number of initiatives, including the designing this website, so-called Home Workers Web, in which they provide guidelines for gig workers so that they can make the most of their work practices. And also, they also organize seminars which advertise the benefits of the autonomous working that gig work can provide, Yeah, so particularly focusing on that, photos of LG workers or female workers or housewives. Yeah, so that kind of promotion they use. So those understanding gig workers and those undertaking gig work are subject to a number of important technological pressures, which act to heighten the degree of direct or indirect control imposed by process of competition and the way in which this governs their working practices. This is a highly visible process of ranking on a job-by-job basis. Yeah, so that each worker has given that, the star. It's got 5 stars or 3-point-something stars. Yeah, so this is highly visible, this kind of ranking system, whereby gig workers are routinely evaluated and then easily compared with their peers through the platform within which they are hired. There's those award system, like monthly remuneration, annual award, which also indirectly controlled workers, the way of working as a gig workers. By praising some of the workers, picking winners, they also kind of penalizing some of the failing workers maybe. And also, even though you are supposed to have autonomy in terms of when to work, there's an online time card which makes it visible who is available. Yeah, so that pressure workers to be available 24/7 maybe. And the physical gig work, which physical time platform workers are controlled by those GPS control as well. So what we've been seeing is that basically these therefore represent a highly sophisticated system of monitoring and person-to-person comparison that significantly increases pressure upon gig workers to compete in order that they are able to be rehired. So we may consider that these technological tools work as a means to selectively constrain and control gig workers and limit their thoughts and conduct. So to conclude, by adopting a cultural political economy approach, my paper and today's talk, my paper trying to analyze the development of the gig economy and gig work in the specific context in Japan. And the paper has highlighted the structural, discursive, and technological selectivities that have combined to generate efforts to portray gig work as a means by which to address a number of socio-economic concerns that have become prevalent within the Japanese national public debate. Through an examination of the concrete case of Japan, the paper trying to go beyond the general critique of gig work, which started emerging within the existing literature, and also try to identify the broader structural, discursive, and technological selectivities that have combined to generate specific outcomes in the case of Japan. Trying to highlight the types of pressure, selectivities that we might observe. For instance, like I already introduced, some of the structural selectivities, that the necessity, the drive for economic growth, importance of a flexible labor supply, social concerns around the aging society, labor shortage issue, the exclusion of some workers from the labor market. So they are presented as something important to address, combined with certain narratives that gig work narrated through a discourse of autonomy, and also deployed, as we saw in the technological selectivity, deployed through a technology of competition and surveillance, therefore presents an opportunity to both the state and to firms to meet the competing pressures which they face in contemporary capitalism. So to conclude, the fictitious nature of the fictitious freedom discourse also potentially constrains the potential to generate new forms of social tension, opposition, or solidarity, maybe, which I should more study about this future as a future subject, future empirical inquiry, because so far there was one union formed specifically for the physical gig worker, Uber Eats union formed. But apart from that, still we haven't quite seen that the level of resistance like we've been seeing in other European or the Western in the Western economies. But that's why that maybe that in the context of Japan, this fictitious nature, but this kind of autonomy, the discourse of autonomy might be sold quite well so far. So maybe there is a limited level of discontent or the solidarity or resistance at the moment. Okay, so thank you very much. I will finish my presentation here.
Thank you very much, Saori, for this very fascinating presentation and very insightful indeed. Can I now request Dr. Phoebe Moore to share her thoughts and comments on this paper?
Thank you so much, Chandrima. I appreciate that. You seem to have frozen. Can everyone hear me all right?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Okay, great. Thank you so much, Saori. And thank you so much, Chandrima. Just as a way of starting off the discussion around this very interesting paper, which is, of course, published in New Political Economy, and the phases for Saori's research as those have been progressing. And I wanted to also give Chandrima a bit of a mini platform too right now, which is in the sense that Saori, Chandrima, and I are all actually part of a journal which we are launching later in the year, which we've been, in fact, putting together for the past decade. So there's a kind of a grounding for it, called Global Political Economy, to be published with Bristol University Press, where we are also hoping this kind of debate, as well as the debates across various problematics relating to the global political economy will be published. So I want to thank Chandrima and Saori for being part of that before I start the discussion. So Saori set out today to talk us through the structural, discursive, and technological selectivities as seen in Jessup and Sum's cultural political economy approach, which have been combined to, in the context of Japan and her case study, to generate a particular kind of gig work. So this being framed and perpetuated by kinds of official discourses, and by specific terminology, specific policies that have allowed for the kinds of fictitious freedoms to emerge around how this model, which in itself requires specific employment relationships, as well as the discourse that's been mentioned, as well as business practices. So as she points out, the trends are both specific to Japan, but also highlight the potential trends and the processes and selectivities that can also be seen in other socioeconomic contexts, whereby those may take nationally specific forms, but there are also nuanced as well as explicit differences across the varieties and the models of capitalism that are referenced here. And Saori's work also does, in fact, look at models of capitalism and specificities within those and other parts of her work. Today, what I want to do is to think about that literature too, and many of you here are very much part of and also drivers of that research framework and research approach. And what I wanted to do is play with the idea of a kind of a model which transcends potentially the national, but for example, as seen in Zuboff's recent thesis on surveillance capitalism. So if we've got the market, state, and negotiated forms as coming out of models of capitalism literature, can we talk about the kinds of normalized discourse that goes into the surveillance capitalism frame, but also not only how those discourses provide a kind of a smokescreen for the fictitious freedoms that you've identified, but also what are the managerial practices within that? And what are the business practices as well? And what kind of model what kind of business model allows for the more transnational surveillance capitalism model to thrive? So actually, Simon Joyce and I have talked about the managerial practices which are potentially obscured by algorithm, right? By the kinds of algorithmic management, by algorithmic bossware that allows for the kind of gig work practices to be enforced in this mediated and supposedly unaccountable way, which of course is framed and enforceable within the kind of framework, within the discourse that Saudis identified. So there's really a conversation to be had around looking at why this is becoming almost a hegemonic model. So, for example, just to point out the types of practices that gig work imbues. So within the taxi driving environment, where decisions, in fact, have been made by technological profiling alone, which of course now is not permitted within GDPR. But there's also the practices of deactivation. So where a worker does not meet, well, I say worker, but within potentially the bogus self-employment contract, and now enforceable in more appropriate terms within the UK. But anyway, so within that framework, how decisions have been made with the obscuring within algorithmic processes have led to dispossession, the lack of social protection, and very high rates of possibility for psychosocial violence. We, in the paper with Simon Joyce, we've also talked about the entering of the hidden abode, as it were, which of course is a quote from Marx's work, whereby we are revealing what exact types of practices allow for this model within this type of business model to occur. But the other thing we talk about, or at least I talk about a lot more, for some international labor organization work that I've done, is to talk about what is a platform enterprise in and of itself, and what are the practices that allow for that. So this is a new hostile platform enterprise, as I talk about it, where companies have specific practices, which are of course required as they are framed within the discourse that they also use, are necessary for innovation, and that there's of course an inherent quality of the entrepreneur that sets out to take up the gig work within the supposed innovative, autonomous potentials that allows for. So just to give you a couple of those to start a discussion, and then I will finish. So within that business model, these specific inherent practices are, for example, companies will internationally look for weakest tax law, weakest labor law, weakest data and privacy protection, privacy law protections, and will in fact send what they call a settler to this particular area to identify how to in fact set up shop by way of a platform, at least in the taxi driving environment, to in a way that can overlook, sidestep, and in fact race to the bottom, as it were, to overlook tax law and regulation and also labor law. So this is how it's actually done, where an individual explicitly looks for methods to do that, and then sets out to monopolize a particular area, a particular sector. And again, if we can use taxi driving as one of the ones that people are most familiar with, whereby, of course, the local taxi companies are immediately put into explicit competition by these supposedly exciting, exhilarating new areas for people to take work almost instantaneously. The difficulties that also Saudi mentioned to some extent today too have to do with the online gig work environment, where people pick up task work, click work by way of such platforms as Mechanical Turks. So some of the practices that allow for that to continue, which involve again the kinds of contracts that do not allow for reliable, long-term protected work, the lack of potentials for social protection by way of trade unions. And some common practices by clients have been wage theft by way of not paying workers when they are not seen to meet criteria with quite unenforceable claims, cyberbullying that occurs across workers as well as from clients, racism across competing workers internationally, and again, no protections also within labor law for home workers. There's also findings from some research that's happened in African countries whereby where it's seen where the business model and also the practices involved are seen to be progressive, are seen to be ways to create a development and increase in jobs, where and potentials for women to take work, for formalization of formerly informal working practices, when in fact what we're finding is increases of domestic violence, where women are working in the home environment, and where in fact these jobs are not really acceptable jobs at all. So my question, and I actually only have one, which of course Saori you can address or might come up also within the discussion. Given what I'm identifying is a globalized model, a globalized platform enterprise, which requires these very specific practices occurring different levels within national context, depending on what kinds of regulation and also existing recent histories in labor coordination. Is there any kind of a chance for a global cyber coordination, which could be seen to confront this globalized business model and these practices and the kinds of discourses that surround it and enforce it and allow it to be to perpetuate? Given this is a global business model, is there a way that we can come up with a framework for challenging, which could be based on the fundamental rights for workers, could be located in comparisons across data protection and privacy, transnational universal rights as set out, for example, within the ILO's Decent Work Framework, the Fair Work campaign as led by people at Oxford University's Internet Institute, and so on. So that's really my one question. And thank you again, Saudi. And Chandrima is going to now start a discussion with all of you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Phoebe Moore. So I'm so used to calling you Phoebe. So thank you very much. We will now take questions from the audience. So we can collect one, maybe 3 questions at a time, and we can start the discussion. Any questions? You can use the raise hand icon, or you can also type in your question. No questions.
I have a further
okay,
one.
So Saori, would you want to start with Phoebe's question?
Yeah, potential for the global cyber coordination. I like the term cyber coordination. I mean, yeah, that we haven't seen, I guess that we haven't really seen much yet, but some of you maybe here that might know better than I do. But because this platform business, they cyber coordinate online, the connect various workers existing globally. So we can't say it's impossible, can we? I guess that, and then also, like you said, that addressing various issues of the private data protection, the fair work. So it's like, I don't know whether that, Phoebe, you might know whether the ILO has such kind of framework. Are they trying to develop certain kind of protocols or regulations? If lots of work's been organized, a platform, then lots can be done online as well. So it's like as we haven't seen much resistance at the moment yet in the case of Japan, but we've been seeing more and more in the other European countries or UK as well. The recent news was that Uber's drivers properly should be recognized as employers rather than contractors. So there's such a development in terms of resistance against this kind of a platform and their exploitation. So I think it's, you know, I will be more optimistic about the coordination at the global scale, I think, because that's part of the benefit of the global connectedness, that which enable to the exploitation, but also at the same time, which enables that global connectedness. So yeah, it would be interesting to see that if there is such kind of, you know, the emergence of that similar, maybe not that global scale, maybe there might be the talks within the EU or within the other European, the transnational union organizations. So yeah, I would say that it's still possible because there's definitely the progress in terms of resistance and solidarity. It's because it's part of the precarity, workers' precarity. So as long as we start conceptualizing these types of new platform work as an extension of the flexible labor market transformations, then I would say that why not in terms of the potential for the global cyber coordination. Maybe you might have other points to make, like ILO or other.
Chandrima is about to ask the questions in the chat bar as well. Yes.
There's Paul first, who raised his hand. Paul, you have a question? Then I'll take the questions from the chat.
Yeah, I suppose it's asking Saori about the issue which myself and Christina Purcell wrote about, is that how do we understand the coexistence of this powerful sort of self-enterprising autonomous narrative at the same time as discontent and even resistance amongst workers? Because I think this is what's quite striking, and why Christina and myself, we chose the title, at least on my own boss, for our article, which sort of tried to sum up this idea of, I know it's awful, I know it's shit, but I've got this out of it as well. And I think in a sense that and Jamie Woodcock's work shows as well that even when gig workers are resisting, they're still acknowledging that there is something in that to some degree. And I think one of the great challenges for us understanding the sociological phenomenon of resistance or the formation of resistance among gig workers is to understand that this is a powerful narrative discourse, and it really does go to the heart of the sort of neoliberal ideological offensive in the sense of what it encapsulates. So I think, you know, one of the great challenges, and I think I'm particularly interested in here how this coexistence, this contradictory coexistence exists among gig workers in a Japanese context.
I mean, you are absolutely right in terms of such kind of, you know, at least we are our own boss type of, you know, the understanding. Because when I look at the Japan's context, there's a survey upon amongst the gig workers conducted by one of the largest trade unions in Japan, association in Japan. And there's relatively surprisingly high level of satisfaction exists. So that clearly tells that, you know, people don't consider exactly the way that I view that, you know, so in a sense it's well sold, but also in the particular context in Japan, because the labor shortage problem is so significant, the aging society, the challenge it poses also significant. And also this kind of a division between the female and the male workers, and then a lack of opportunities for female workers, and the gendered labor market. These contexts also contribute to the kind of notion of, you know, that it's kind of a useful new opportunity. You know, you do it between your housework and childcare. You do it between that, you know, some of the other part-time work, and then once you have a bit available time, you do it. You use your kind of a gap in your life. That kind of selling is really well captured. So some people think that I am choosing what tasks to perform, even though some people notice that, you know, it's so fragmented tasks, it's really cheap, unless even though you work so many hours, you know, you don't really get that kind of, you know, that sufficient income. But because it's promoted as some kind of side work sometimes, then that it's like, for a side work, it's maybe okay. Is that some kind of, you know, the satisfaction? And also people don't really, like you said, that you are basically choosing when to work, where to work. Then that's something that kind of people might think that, you know, it's not so much they are controlled.
I mean, that's not everybody, obviously, but I think it is a phenomenon. It is a phenomenon that is particularly heightened within gig economy.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, and that's why that I think we might see that compared to other industrial relations, that it might take a longer time to develop such kind of solidarities, even though there's a development.
Yeah, and there's also the danger of a spillover of that type of narrative into the rest of the more standardized employment.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll shut up anyway.
Yeah.
Thanks, Saori.
Thank you.
Thank you. Saori, there are two questions in the chat section. So one is from James Thompson. Do you think legal challenges on worker status like Uber BV versus Aslam UK Supreme Court ruling will go towards making positive moves against the official discourse observed in Japan as well as across the world?
Yeah. I mean, like Uber Eats, there's a union in Japan, the Uber Eats union, which is only at the moment amongst those physical gig workers union, I think, as far as I know. But there's been already Uber Eats union in Japan has been reporting quite a lot about this recent case, the legal case. And then they are obviously using it to appeal to the government, appeal to the employers. And then there was some case recently, the Uber Eats, that there was some kind of the wages that illegally reduced, or they were not paying the proper amount to workers. So they were officially apologized. That was just happened like yesterday or something. But there was this kind of those global case where that they show that illegality of some of the platform employment practices. That's definitely, I think, it's an impact on the case. But I think at least we need a platform. In the case of Japan, there's a lot of kind of grassroots unions. They don't have specifically promote that they will support gig workers, but they are obviously working for the precarious workers or every workers, whoever wants to come to talk to them, they will open. So there's this grassroots, the trade unions in Japan which don't constrained by enterprise unions Japan, like traditional Japanese enterprise unions. So there's definitely a potential there, I think.
Thank you. And I think this, you have kind of explained this. There's another question from MR Wakfi. It's about, is there any organized effort among gig workers in Japan to defend their collective rights?
Like I said, that it's not so much sort of called gig workers unions, apart from Uber Eats unions. So it's more sort of the people who are working. So as long as, even though they were contractors, when I interviewed a Japanese union activist, when I interviewed them, does it make, do you need to create a new grassroots unions to represent those gig workers because they are contractors? But they said that it's the Japanese legal, the system, that labor union case is that as long as you are working, you get represented by the unions. You can create your own union as long as you have another colleague or something together. You can form that, even though that's such a small scale grassroots union, you can still form the union under the branch of certain kind of grassroots union. So there are certain unions they are working for, specifically for gig workers, but it's not like individual apart from Uber Eats union, there is no like individual that specifically focused on the gig workers at the moment. But then I will expect there will be some new kind of forms of unions might start emerging because of the the increasing number of expanding number of platform workers in Japan. But also that needs to be promoted, that they are entitled to be represented by unions. So they workers need to know exactly that they can go to unions, I guess. But I would expect there's more development in the future, I think. So that's something interesting to kind of to keep an eye on, I think.
Okay, there is I can see a hand raised, but I can't read the name. Whoever it is, can you please unmute?
Carl. It's Carl.
Oh,
Oh,
hi,
okay,
yeah,
it's Carl.
it's Carl. Yeah.
Okay,
hi.
please go ahead.
So, I read the paper, listened to the presentation, great throughout. One thing that you mentioned is, yeah, the non-regular employees in the gig sector are increasingly including the old in Japan. That's quite odd to me, at least. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Sorry, say again. That what did you say?
Sorry, I'm speaking way too fast.
No, it's okay.
So, one thing that you mentioned, both in the presentation and in the paper, is that non-regular work and gig economy specific work is increasingly targeting the old, which is quite unusual, at least in my experience of Western gig economy work. As a young person, I understand the typical discourse is to sell the concept of precarious work to the young. Notions of flexibility and self-ownership to build this fictitious freedom that you describe. However, I don't have as much knowledge or experience of the versions that target the elderly. So you mentioned Crowdworks in particular has targeted them. It might be a bit of a barrage of questions here. It's 3 related ones and then one unrelated one. So can you go a bit more into what it is specifically that Crowdworks does with the elderly workers in the gig economy, specifically in their working practices?
Yeah. Thank you, Carl. Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting to know that because of these aging populations, and then in the case of Japan, once they hit the certain kind of retirement age, the company trying to rehire them with much cheaper, the wages. Yeah, so after like 65 years old, they can be rehired, possibly, depending on the workplace, but they get much cheaper pay. So there's this kind of, but also the traditional working practices in Japan is like long working hours, and even though you are rehired, maybe you are expected to perform longer hours as well. So they're trying to appeal to there's a kind of reserves or a pool of those elderly workers who are still completely capable and they're still healthy enough to carry on working, and so then there's so many of them in the case of Japan because of the high proportion of that, the retirement age or post-retirement age, but completely capable workers. So that's the kind of maybe the Japan-specific thing that so much advanced aging society. That's obviously platform economy, platform gig firms. They call it in Japan. They call it crowd company or crowd works, and that's another kind of a possible potential clients for them. Because what they want is that they want to register as many people as possible, and then they put that we have this number of people that who is experienced, including the experienced elderly workers. So that's how they kind of want to promote. They even promote like using the media or TV tools to appeal to that those elderly workers that there is this opportunity. This is a new form of work. You get to choose when to work, what to work, where to work. So this is that, they're trying to present it as something very attractive to some of the elderly workers who want to keep certain work-life balance, but also, wants to stay in some kind of employment. So that's the kind of appeal that they're trying to advocate maybe. So that might be that, that specific case maybe in Japan. Because of the elderly aging society.
what kind of labor is it though that they're conducting? So you've got, for example, taxi work and stuff like that. Is it a different variety of work, or is it that exact thing?
Yeah, there's an online base, so it could be like designing, the creative line of work. It could be like a financial office and office work, so which can be like accounting for the companies. So it used to be done at the finance sector, but now it's kind of outsourced through the platform to those individual workers. You can just do those that like a trivial works, but it's important in the office work. Yeah, that kind of things that which doesn't manually demanding, which are not that manually demanding, physically demanding work. So there's a kind of creative line of work, administrative type of work, and also like translation, transcribing, those kind of that small types of micro tasks. So there are fully many available, I think.
Mm-hmm. And then there's the other one, because I feel like you answered the other sub-questions I had related to crowdworks. How have the efforts of those organising against the gig economy in Japan, how have their efforts been integrated in the political demands of any opposition parties to construct a counter-hegemony, if at all? So, for example, the Communist Party or Reiwa Shinsengumi, or any of those been involved at all?
Yeah, not so much as far as I know. There are certain unions, many community unions or grassroots activist unions. They were supposedly mostly independent. So they don't have too much of a political association. Some of them have to the certain current opposition parties in Japan. But like a Japanese Communist Party don't seem to be particularly so Communist Party sometimes, so they are not particularly attached to particular parties. That there's not much, like as far as I know, the grassroots level unions, they are not so much integrated with this kind of a new forms of work, the new type of gig workers solidarities. To be honest, well, unfortunately, maybe, but. I don't know whether that's a good or bad, but yeah, so it's not so much kind of, they do those unions which trying to represent those precarious workers. They do have appeal against the government or against the some of the business associations, but not like formal channels that so far created, I don't think.
Thank you for answering.
Thank you. Yeah.
Saori, we have another question in the chat section. It's about, it's from Mr. Wakfi, and it's about presuming that gig worker works as contractor. Does he have any copyright, patenting rights, etc. if she makes a discovery or invents something new while doing the contracted task?
As far as I know, that there's cases of that. Actually, there's not, so that's, I think, left quite gray area. So some cases, the gig worker present their ideas, and then they, basically it's a competition on the platform. So they do provide their ideas. They share their design with the potential clients through the platform, and then sometimes the evil the companies who are looking for some gig workers, they just steal the idea. So there's there are some cases where those platform gig workers really lost their opportunity. Their ideas were actually stolen without realizing. Or sometimes the opposite cases are the gig workers, they basically reproduce or reuse their same. So some of the work, the fragmented task is that they write some mini adverts for some commodity, some goods, to promote, let's say, like cosmetics or something. So these lipsticks, that there's a certain, dogs are joining. Stop it. So there's some small, like advertising wording with that fragmented task, and then they because the gig workers, they reused it to various companies. So some of the platform companies were forced into collapse collapsing. So they kind of, some of the platform companies actually went into bankruptcies or because of that, the claim. So it's absolutely right to kind of pay attention to that area because it's it's very gray zone as far as I know at the moment. But I think that's something that, we will probably, it will become something important points to talk about in the future as well. I think it's, I haven't really studied much yet, but there's those kind of cases. I think you are muted. Sorry?
Hello. Can you hear, Saori?
Yeah. I think Emma was trying to show something, no?
I can't see any questions in the chat or any hands raised here. So, Paul, can you see anything?
No, I can't. No.
Okay, I can see something in the chat box now. This is from James Thompson. Thanks for your answer. As a follow-up, in a practice sense, do you view granting labor in the gig economy worker status, both crowd work and physical work, and hence entitling them to certain protections such as minimum wages as being an effective method to transforming platform-mediated work into more desirable form of work? Would status change end the fictitious freedom problem?
I mean, that's one way of guaranteeing the better work, I guess, in a sense, by showing that setting certain kind of level of minimum wages. Amongst the Japanese platform companies, actually, there are some companies they started, I think in a way they were addressing to the certain concerns which being raised in the platform economy. So some platform companies started saying, we don't accept below this kind of a minimum wages. So they set the minimum wages by themselves on their own initiative at about 1.5 times higher than the regionally set minimum wages. So there's such companies are emerging as well, but obviously it's not going to be, race to the bottom kind of effect also happens. So there are some kind of regulations may be ideal, but at the same time, it's not just about the wages as well. I think it's a kind of a certain surveillance, control, the data protection issues, and then one of the things that we just talked about, that the protection of intellectual property protection, those types of issues are also involved here as well, to make them kind of a problems or challenges more complicated. So on top of those kind of a wage, the setting certain wage, but it's also difficult because of the task-based payment system. So we can still, the platform companies can still set the per hour. If this task takes 10 minutes to complete, then the hourly wages should be about this, and then that in that way they can set the certain minimum wages for the platform economies. But as far as I could tell, the government and the business associations, the leading gig firms, they are not going for that direction unless there are certain kind of resistance and discontent clearly articulated. It will be quite difficult to go that way because the government firms aim is to keep the employment relations as flexible as possible, and the gig work is a welcome addition to such flexible employment relations. So the government is really going for that, trying to maintain such flexible employment relations. So it's not going to be easily, such policy will be introduced in Japan, I don't think.
Any other questions before we draw the session to a close? Okay, I think there are no questions. Okay, I have a question. I think I can see in the chat section. This is from H. Mock. Resistance efforts by gig workers are typically represented by grassroots, rank and file focused, and usually smaller unions. This seems to be the case around the world, including in Japan. I would like to ask, the question is, if you see the more established traditional unions can play a role, do you think they can play a role? Do you think these unions are capable of adopting to the new conditions, at least in the context of Japan?
Well, I'm a bit skeptical of the traditional unions' role in terms of the representing gig workers, because they already, particularly like Rengo, the main labor trade union associations and enterprise unions, they already still have problems in terms of representing non-regular workers. They still focus on the long-term employed within the company regular workers. So, still they haven't done enough in terms of representing the flexibly employed non-regular workforce. So I think it's still quite difficult to expect, to imagine those large trade unions, that typical established traditional trade unions, to even go to expand their representation for the gig workers. So I think it's going to be quite slow progress in terms of Japan. I think I'm more optimistic in terms of grassroots activism in Japan, rather than the traditional enterprise unions and the large union association, that it's more sort of independently made, precariat unions, or the youth unions, or civil society, or cities, NPOs, non-profit organizations. They are much quicker to adjust to those kind of problems in the labor market facing the precarious workers. So I'm more optimistic to this kind of in terms of the grassroots unions rather than the traditional unions.
Okay, thank you so much. And I just need to make one small thing, that the questions that were from Emar Bakvi was actually from Ismail Buyukakan. So
thank you.
Just to clarify. Any other questions that we can take? And if not, then Paul, would you like? Okay, I think there is another question. There have been.
Sorry, that's not a question. It's just me commenting.
Okay, that's just a commenting. Would you like to go ahead, please, then?
Sure, if you really want me to comment. So I was just agreeing with what Saori had to say. If you read the Woodcock and Aslam workers' inquiry that they produced on the Uber dispute a couple of years ago, you'll find that there were difficulties in getting established unions in the UK to represent gig sector workers over here. In the case of the Uber drivers here, they had their own independent union that got merged into GMB at some point, which, for those not in the UK, is one of the 3 largest unions in the country. And in particular, what happened there is that GMB simultaneously had the Uber drivers branch in London, but also had another private hire and traditional taxi firm branch within their own organisation. And they would shortchange the Uber private drivers in preference of the more traditional taxi firm union. And in particular, it was causing tensions because there is a significant racial divide in the composition between Uber drivers in the United Kingdom and the more traditional black cab and standard private hire taxi services, which are more predominantly white in composition. So it seemed like the established unions had not just established unionship and recognition, but also established interests, which they preferred to represent over the gig sector workers. Anyway, that was me doing a crank speech in favour of independent grassroots stuff.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Carl, for your comment. Paul, would you like to let the audience know about our next webinar? And before that, I would like to thank Saori for accepting our invitation and making this fascinating presentation and sharing your work with us. Thank you so very much.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great time. Thanks.
Thank you, Saori. Thank you very much. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Chandrima. Just to let you know, our next webinar is in 2 weeks' time with David Coates, who are former TUC economic analyst, who has written a report recently along in association with the Alex Ferry Foundation, looking at how industrial and post-industrial communities, towns in the UK are likely to fare in the transition and the challenges of transitions in the face of climate change, COVID, pandemic, technological and Brexit challenges. It's very much picking up on the ILO themes of a just transition. This report was widely reported by, particularly by the Mirror, basically saying the so-called left behind towns in the UK, and his studies particularly on Redcar in the northeast, Teesside. It is Teesside, I think, Redcar. So please come along. All welcome again. We'll send out the usual, well, I'll send out the usual advertisements around the lists, and I hope you can join us and have another enjoyable session, as it was this time, Saori, which was excellent. Thank you. That's my bit.
Thank you, Saori.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for attending.